Last time, we followed Marius to his death 2 weeks into his 7th consulship. Today, we evaluate his life to better understand how he helped kill the Roman Republic. Plutarch views Marius's life as an apparent contradiction between his great achievements and his insatiable desire for more. His argument goes something like this. If only Marius had been of a stronger character, he wouldn't have been tempted to repeatedly break the law. If only he had resisted the urge to break the law, the political system would have held. But is that really true? Or is Marius a symptom of something wrong about the structure of the Roman government itself? The answers to these kinds of questions are difficult to find because one has to engage in counterfactual or hypothetical history. If we could somehow heal the intractable problems between the Senate and the concilium plebis, would Marius still be viewed as a killer of the Republic? Probably not. If the politics of the Middle Republic were stable, and everyone obeyed the law, then Marius would never have been able to do things like accept volunteers into his army, usurp command of the army, hold multiple consecutive consulships, or command troops as a private citizen. But the political situation wasn't stable. While the Romans were attempting to solve the questions of land reform and citizenship, they were failing at it badly. In this environment, it was inevitable that political factionalism would get worse as each faction had their own answer for the questions of land reform and citizenship. The populares wanted more land for more citizens, while the optimates wanted to keep control of the state in the hands of the traditional nobility. As each side became more comfortable with using novel political maneuvers and extraordinary measures to accomplish the most basic tasks of government, the system as a whole became less and less stable. Eventually, this would end in a generation of civil wars that would never stop until all political power was concentrated in the hands of one man. Marius can be viewed as a prototype of what that one man might eventually look like. His role in killing the Roman Republic was the establishment of a type of charismatic general with a special relationship to his troops. Many of Marius's troops were not eligible for military service absent his innovations in recruitment. By accepting volunteers and paying them from his fortune, Marius sidestepped the legal process of levying an army and made much of his army personally loyal to him, rather than to any abstract idea of the Republic. Other military commanders, like Sulla, took note and imitated Marius's example. This close and inappropriate relationship between the troops and their general made it easier to go on campaign without the approval of the government. In fact, Marius spent much of his time in politics undermining senatorial control over the army of the Republic. In its place, he humbly presented himself as the final authority over military matters. This pattern would repeat itself not only in his recruitment practices, but also in his usurpation of Metellus's army during the Jugurthine War, and his attempted usurpation of Sulla's army in 88 BCE. And again in the civil war of 87 between Cinna and Octavius. In that last case, Marius should not have been able to intervene militarily in the conflict at all. But he did. Why? Because his veterans in Africa and Italy felt that they owed their former commander and agreed to obey him, even in the capacity of a private citizen. That was never how the Roman army was supposed to work. But that wasn't the only way that Marius degraded the Roman constitution. In usurping control of Metellus's army via plebiscite, he not only changed the relationship between the Roman commander and his troops, but he also stoked the pre-existing division between the Senate and the plebeian council. The Senate was always in control of foreign affairs, including military affairs. Furthermore, the Senate was supposed to take precedence over the concilium plebis. The traditional check on senatorial power was the veto, held by any of the tribunes of the plebs. If the Roman constitution were functioning normally, Marius, as consul, would only have been able to take control of the army from Metellus via senatus consultum, and not an act of the plebeian council. That, after all, was the way the command of the army was assigned to Metellus in the first place. The Senate, having its decision overturned arbitrarily, had every reason to fear continued efforts to undermine its authority. Perhaps here we can see evidence for Plutarch's theory. Marius did do all of this undermining specifically to advance his political career, and if he hadn't, then maybe the system would have held for longer. But all that was required in such an environment of instability was a sufficiently ambitious politician to test the limits of the system. If Marius hadn't done it, it probably would have been done by somebody else. What about the things Marius did that were not the result of his moral failings, yet nonetheless were corrosive to the rule of law? All the consecutive illegal consulships he held during the Cimbric Wars were not so much the result of a moral failing on Marius's part, as it was a response to a genuine military emergency. Marius just so happened to be in the right place at the right time. He was the lone victorious general on the scene who held a high enough rank in the government to actually meet the Germanic threat. It wasn't his fault that it took a few years for the Germans to invade Italy. Furthermore, while everyone knew the illegal consulships flew directly in the face of the Roman constitution, very few seemed to understand that they set a terrible precedent for other ambitious military commanders to follow in the future. Increasingly, in Marius's own lifetime, command of a military force would become necessary for the continued safety of Roman politicians, as political assassination and mob violence threatened the lives of consuls and senators alike. This would be especially true for men like Sulla. He would even revive the long-defunct office of dictator to stay in command of his troops, and therefore the Roman state, without the need for Marius's consecutive consulships. This office of dictator had been discontinued for centuries, owing to the creation and evolution of the office of the proconsul. Proconsuls had the kind of unrestricted military and judicial powers as the archaic dictator, but limited to a specific territory. Conversely, they had none of the civil responsibilities that the true consul presiding at Rome had. Because dictatorial powers were limited to the magistrates far from the city, and because wars increasingly were fought far from home, the office of dictator had largely fallen into obsolescence by Marius's day. You simply didn't need one anymore. But it was Marius's consecutive consulships that proved to many in politics two important facts about the state of the Republic. One, adherence to the old constitution was apparently optional. The ancient practices of the Republic could be suspended in times of great political or military emergency. In time, they will be suspended for no good reason at all. Two, the government worked better when power was concentrated into the hands of one preeminent politician. That was when the Romans scored their military victories. It allowed the state to push through political stalemate, by legal means or otherwise. Marius helped to advance this process quite a bit. Perhaps the best illustration would be the events surrounding his attempted usurpation of Sulla's army, his exile to Africa, and his reign of terror culminating with his 7th consulship. Firstly, Marius was far too old to be commanding troops in battle, as evidenced by his lackluster performance during the Social War. The planned campaign in Greece, and eventually Anatolia, would be arduous and take years. It was no place for a nearly 70-year-old man. Next, Marius should have remembered how his usurpation of Metellus's army in Africa nearly caused a civil war. The only reason it didn't was through the adroit political maneuvering of the Senate. The senators cleverly issued a joint triumph to both men, which turned the temperature down on an already unstable situation and allowed for a peaceful transition of command. Marius seemed to learn the opposite lesson from it, though. He learned that it was possible to usurp command, and if it worked once, surely he could do it again. He seemingly never considered that the circumstances facing the state had changed drastically since the days of the Jugurthine War. The army that Marius was usurping was not located on a foreign shore, but stationed right here in Capua, just a short march from the capital. Marius seemed to be caught totally unprepared by Sulla's march on Rome. It's hard to fault him for running for his life, but all of his actions in exile make him uniquely culpable for the death of the Roman Republic. If Marius had simply retired to private life, rather than try to usurp the army of Sulla, then all of the following illegalities surely would never have happened. But try to usurp the army he did. This set an important precedent for future Romans. Command was not reserved for men of consular rank alone. Rather, armies could be bought, inherited, and wielded by anyone at all. Worse yet, when one man came to be in control of the capital, he could be expected to rule arbitrarily and by force. No one in the Roman state could hope to see the Roman system fall into the hands of a benevolent tyrant. Instead, this phenomenon of one-man rule would continue to become more common during the rest of the century, culminating in the civil wars of Julius and Augustus Caesar. But that is a story for another time. Making a series like this is a labor of love, and each view and subscription gives me the motivation to continue producing high-quality content for viewers like you. Your support is appreciated, and it does matter. If you agree with my assessment of Gaius Marius' responsibility for the death of the Roman Republic, be sure to leave a comment. If you don't agree, I especially want to know about it. Join me next time for another round of The Men Who Killed the Roman Republic. I'm Matt Lupu. Thanks for listening.